Whatever, guys, we are back, and today we are luckily joined by the man that some may know as the mayor of the Nutmeg State, the man in the hat, 1/3 of 3 Puck, the great, powerful Chuck Mindenhall. Chuck, it is an honour and a privilege to have you join us today, man. How are you doing?
I'm fine, man. You sound just like Ariel Helwani, only is it New Zealand? Is it New Zealand or Australia?
Australia.
Okay, Australia. Sorry, I don't mean to insult. So
no.
Yeah.
I just sort of should have added the back in your life, but
yes. Or when he says the and you can do that.
Yeah. Chuck, look, man, I'll start off with I've actually been an avid fan and listener of the Ringer MMA show from its inception with yourself, P.T. Carroll, and of course the newly acclaimed Birdwatcher apparently, and Ariel Helwani, and I can't forget TST as well. Can you talk to me about how the show came about, and what it's been like, being a part of the show each week, as it's clear that you guys all have an amazing chemistry.
I went to the Ringer and I said, we're doing the show, and that was that, man. No, that's not how it went down. It was actually mentioned to me. They had something called the Green Room back in the day. It was and Locker Room, but even before that, it was called Locker Room was the original, I think. David Shoemaker, who was my editor with the Ringer, he had mentioned possibly wanting to get like an MMA type show to do it. He'd talked to me a little bit about that, and I was like, yeah, man, that would be awesome. I know that the space could use it. Now, nothing really material. Things move slow over there. But when I heard that Ariel was involved, right? Like as soon as they said Ariel was was talking to the Ringer. First of all, I thought it was too good to be true because he was at ESPN. I was like, this would be a really weird move, if he does this. But as he got serious with Bill Simmons, the guy who runs the Ringer, and they were talking, and it became a thing. Ariel submitted the guys that he wanted to do it with. They'd already been talking to me, so I made sense. And he mentioned P.T. Carroll, and I think he'd mentioned somebody else too who wasn't able to do it. But P.T. Carroll, like we worked together at Mma Fighting. He threw it together, and when they made the show, they said this would be the guy. These would be the dudes, and it just happened. You know what I mean? It just kind of happened. It took a couple of months for them to figure it out, but they gave us the concept, and I think that we've kind of defined the Spotify Live thing. A lot of the other podcasts that have been trying it, I don't think they found their rhythm. But from the get go, we've involved the community, and it just became a thing right away. But that's working with those guys, man. They make it so easy. You know what I mean? Like the chemistry was there from day one, and yeah, it's just been a lot of fun, man.
Yeah, for sure. So, Chuck, something I wanted to ask you was, with just about 15 years now of experience covering the sport of MMA, in what way has the mainstreaming of the sport both hurt and helped the sport?
Ooh, that's a good one. It's funny because the first few years, and I don't know how long you guys have been on the beat, but the first few years when I was like 2007 through 2010, even beyond that, like 2012, like those first 5 years or so, it was all about trying to legitimize the sport, even from the journalistic perspective, because people would be like, what, They just had such a weird idea about MMA, or they thought it was a taboo, or just, crazy people were involved in the sport. And so even at working at ESPN, just even convincing bosses at ESPN to like pay more attention to it and to get it more coverage, it was just an uphill battle. I think everybody wanted it to be legitimized, but once it became that way, that boom period with McGregor and Rousey and all that, it was fun. But with that kind of exposure and mainstream success, there comes more scrutiny, right? So I feel like in the end, maybe we're shining the light on the right places, fighter pay, things of that nature. Like maybe the scrutiny is warranted, and it should be as that enterprise grows. Personally, I kind of liked it better when it was kind of our secret. You know what I mean? Like it was like
the underground forums of Sherdog MMA.
Yeah, man. I used to love just have, it was kind of like the secret nod of people who are, paying attention to the sport. You just had something you knew you were going to connect with them. It's a little different, man. I still think the hardcores though are the hardcores and the casuals are the casuals. You know what I mean? So there are a lot more casuals now. You know what I mean? And that makes it not as fun, but so I think I preferred the older days, to be honest.
100%. Chuck, you've obviously become synonymous with the man in the hat tagline with with your notable hat that you don and I wanted to get your take behind it. Is there any significance in terms of the hat, and do you remember who was the first to crown you the man in the hat?
That would be Ariel. I mean, the hat just kind of morphed. I was always a hat guy anyway, but then as soon as I started shaving my head, it felt good to have something covering it, man, especially in cold weather. Now, it just sort of happened in the fight game. I had the hat, and as I wore it on the MMA beat, back in the day with Luke Thomas and Ariel and Jeff. That's when Ariel started calling me. And of course, the man in the hat, Chuck Mindenhall. And then people started to say the man in the hat, you know, and it became synonymous. And once that became the thing, it was like, you might as well ride the shtick out, right? So like now a lot of people know me as the man in the hat and the myth. So I just ran with it, man.
Yeah, for sure. So, Chuck, look, I'm curious what your interest level is in Adesanya versus Pereira, the rematch. And as well as he is, certainly deserving of the rematch based on pure merit as a champion, just to get that out of the way. But for me personally, I feel like the answer on who wins that fight has already been provided in 3 different fights now. And admittedly, 2 of them were in kickboxing. But for me, my interest level in the rematch isn't that high. I just feel like it's one of those cases where Pereira has his number in this case.
That's really interesting, man, to hear you say that, because I think we've been trying to gauge this, to be honest. It's a weird one, right? It's a little bit weird. In one way, I think that Israel Adesanya needed a foil, just like Chael Sonnen needed. Anderson Silva needed Chael Sonnen, right, back in the day to kind of get him over. In a strange way, I think Izzy might have benefited from this, and I think that the rematch, if it's done correctly, this is the hard part, because we've already had the narrative that, he's fighting a guy who has his number. Now you have a situation where he beat him in MMA, he beat him in the UFC centric people. Where does that interest lie to see him rectify that or to get it back? I'm personally interested in it, but it's a little weird because I'm pretty close actually to where Alex Pereira trains. I just down the road. And so I know a lot of his guys and stuff like that. There's a little bit of me that's I feel like that's the biggest fight, because Izzy has just not had a lot of real challengers. He hasn't had guys that cast doubt over the situation or have his number. And I think that his psychology is so good. He's so well tuned that I'm I kind of want to see what happens with it. What happens when you're down 0-3 and you get this situation as a champion? I mean, I kind of pointed this out. I don't know if you heard me talking about this. I think I mentioned this on our show. It's almost like whose story was really being told the whole time, right? Was it Israel Adesanya we were telling his story as this guy was a nobody, and then all of a sudden he's up there and now it's become his story. He takes Izzy's crown and you're like, okay, now it's his story. I do feel like I need to see Izzy have that chance, you know what I mean? To see definitively what that is. Whether that translates into a bigger fight, I don't know. I feel like it will, but I totally get where you're coming from, man. It might take some real clever marketing in the lead up to get that to where it needs to be. But I think it has potential to be a huge fight, really.
Maybe Izzy just needs to throw a dolly through a bus window.
The surest way to pay-per-view numbers all time. Yeah.
Chuck, look, speaking on yesterday's show, I was listening, and you did mention that Izzy was the big picture winner coming away from the loss, considering how he handled the loss, his actions post-fight and everything. In the eventual rematch with Alex, Pereira next year, do you think that Izzy should head into that rematch with the same confidence and brashness that he usually shows before a fight? Or do you believe we could see maybe a more quieter, reserved Israel Adesanya heading into that eventual rematch?
I wouldn't be surprised if it's that. I actually thought he was dialed back, to be honest. Fairly dialed back going into this fight. He didn't go
dancing,
into the
walking in. It was very
none of that, right? He wasn't setting the bar of expectation as high. I felt like he had a quiet resolve to go in there and make it a fight. Maybe take away that boring label that's kind of starting to seep in on him a little bit. I wouldn't be surprised at all, though, to be honest, if he really toned it back for this fight. As long as the UFC's not breathing down his neck to be out there promoting, I could see him doing that. I also think he's just a natural at telling the truth. He's a very sincere guy. I mean, I think he has proven that time and again. He gets an interview, I think he tells you genuinely what's on his mind. He doesn't sugarcoat certain things. I feel like he'll still be that, but I could see him toning it down. I really could. I think he would. It's all business. He's got to go in there and perform, right? Otherwise, everything. If he goes in there and loses again, it's crazy to even say that he could become a footnote in this whole thing. I mean, but he could. He could become the footnote in that situation. So I wouldn't be surprised, man. It's literally the fight of his life going into that one, So I could see him doing that for sure.
So, Chuck, obviously a somewhat more somber moment for the MMA community in the last week or so, but Anthony Rumble Johnson passing away quite recently. I was just wondering if you could speak to his contribution to the sport and if you have a favorite Rumble moment, as I know mine's always going to be him essentially knocking out Glover Teixeira's mouthpiece into the crowd. That was just one of the best knockouts I've ever seen.
That one aged really well. I mean, obviously with the Glover being where he's at now, And there are a bunch. There are a bunch. I was talking a little bit about this with the guys, Pizzi and Ariel, but I did a piece on him where I sat down with him and talked to him for a good chunk of time. I've done this a couple of times, but this one particular time, he was very close to closing in on a belt. I want to say it was pretty close to when he beat Phil Davis. It was right around that time in Baltimore. And I was talking to him. He was closing in on a title shot, and I just said I kept trying to get him to talk about what it would mean for him to get that title, especially coming in his trajectory from 170 pounds, missing weight. He had some problems, like I was like, what would it mean for you to do this? And all he could talk about was his grandma and grandpa, like his grandma who lived out in Georgia, who had raised him. And he was like, he just wanted to do it for her. And he was getting a little almost emotional talking about it. He's like, if I won it, she'd be wearing that to church. Her name was Pearline. And he was like, I know she would want it more than me. They would be having a parade for her. He was like talking about this. And every time I talked about it, that's how he went. Like he wasn't even thinking about it from a vanity standpoint of how he would treat it, calling guys out. I don't think that was his way, man. Like he was he was quietly a very good person. I know he had some problems, he had some problems, but he's a very human person who tried to overcome those problems. And his heart, I think, ultimately was in the right place. His contribution, man, I mean, I think there was a lot of different things he showed. And I think one of the big ones was that you shouldn't probably cut back kind of way. I said he's got like a yogi's power of reduction, physical reduction to be able to show up and at 170 pounds, which blows my mind still to this day. And I saw him fight that a couple of times, but just the success he had, right, at 205 and even heavyweight, like, if you're a big guy like that, I think he showed something about that. And I think guys have used him as an example to like, you know what? We saw this guy try a lot of different things. He's a pioneer in a weird way for doing that. But man, that power and everything else, just everything he generated, I think he's left a definite stamp on this, man. Just like you said, there's some big time memorable moments that he left in the cage there.
100%. Chuck, one thing I want to switch gears and talk about just quickly is Michael Chandler. Obviously, he's coming off one of the, he's becoming one of the most exciting fighters to watch on, if not, the most exciting fighter to watch on the roster. Yeah. I know Ariel is in favor of a Michael Chandler versus Conor McGregor fight, which I am as well. I think it would be a huge, exciting fight. What are your thoughts for Chandler's next fight? And considering the damage he's taken recently, do you think we see much more of Michael Chandler after this next fight?
It's a good question. And I keep saying, like, every time we watch one of these types of wars, where literally the guys are on the verge of being out multiple times in a single fight, all the blood, all the big blows. I'm like, I just can't imagine he has a ton more of those in him, man. Yeah. And remember, this is a guy who was doing it 10 years ago against Eddie Alvarez, right? Yeah. Like, this is a guy who's had those kinds of fights in the past. It's crazy because I keep thinking at some point he'll default back to his wrestling roots a little more and kind of control it a little more and try to minimize damage. But it seems like his big exhilaration is to put on a show. And it's crazy because he stole that mantle, I think, from Justin Gaethje in the end. Gaethje was always the guy who fought like this, the wrestler who now turned into a brawler. I think that he still holds that. I honestly don't think he can continue that much more. But I also think what has happened is he has emerged as that guy, that action A side. So they could book him. It doesn't have to be, if you want to reward him for fighting that way, a Conor McGregor fight is totally fine. I would love it. I think most people would love that. If you want to just tone it back, he could fight anybody from 10 to 6 in that rankings. And I think it would be cool because he doesn't have to go in there against a killer. You could give him a bounce back fight. You could, and also if he's going to go in there and fight the way he fights anyway, he's the A side in that scenario, right? Like I think he's proven that he's the action guy he's going to throw down. He's going to drag that fight into something big. So I feel like they could do anything with Michael Chandler at this point. But from a fan standpoint, I love it, but I'm always a little bit like, don't do that too much, man. I don't want you, stuttering as you get older. You know what I mean? So hopefully not be like that.
Yeah, for sure. So look, Chuck, last question from us, man. We really appreciate you giving us some time, but we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but as the sport kind of grows, each year and the number of people covering the sport is going to grow, on a pretty regular basis. Do you think that as the fan base becomes more knowledgeable and more critical of the sports media, that it's going to become harder to stand out and become a mainstay as a member of the MMA media, covering mixed martial arts as the sport continues to grow and become more mainstream?
Gosh, that's a great question, man. It was funny because back in the day, like you could just show up, and if you did something really well, that's how you distinguish. I was always a writer first. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a writer. All the podcasts and stuff that just came later, and it was just a byproduct of that. But like I knew I could do that, and I was able to distinguish it. A lot of it now is where you're at. Like, for instance, if you could be a guy who nobody knows, but if you end up on ESPN, right? Like if you're doing something like that, I think the platform now matters in a big deal, the visibility and all that stuff. Standing out, though, I think it's going to be a little harder, to be honest, because the people who now we have a long enough history of coverage of the sport where the people who've stood out, you're going to be making comparisons of guys coming up, and they're trying to do interviews. Well, you're comparing them to Ariel Helwani, right? Like you're going to compare them to these things. So you now have examples of guys who've succeeded. So I think it might be a little tougher, to be honest, like to break into the sport. I think it behooves you to have kind of like multiple talents within it, like to have a range, like so you can talk like this, or you can write, or whatever it is. If you have several things you could do well, and you're smart in how you handle that, I think that's good. And keeping up with the technology, especially social media and all that stuff, man, it's so different from when I started. But it seems to me the most visible guys, I don't know if they stand out. They all kind of seem like there's a bunch of those guys who get a lot of visibility, but are they distinguishing themselves? I don't really think so, but that is another avenue. I just think that it'll be tougher going on because there are more people covering it. You know what I mean? There are more people, and there are people doing it really well already. So it's gonna be tougher and tougher as we go on.
Chuck, like Alex said, man, we don't take too much of your time. So I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Like I said, I'm an avid listener, so it's been a real pleasure to sit down and chat with you, man. And we'd love to have you on again in future.
Anytime, fellas. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Awesome.
Chuck. Appreciate
Thanks
it,
very much, man.